archaeologists cracked open a sealed stone chest in the ruins of a medieval English monastery. Inside was a monk's personal kit, a wooden rosary, a small knife, a leather pouch of dried herbs, and tucked beneath all of it, a clay pipe with residue still caked into the bowl. The monks had been smoking something. The question was what? When researchers tested the residue, they found cannabis in a monastery in medieval England. The man who owned this pipe had taken a vow of poverty, a vow of chastity, and apparently kept a personal stash. But he wasn't the first person in the medieval world to figure this out. That story starts much earlier and moves in a direction nobody expects. Hemp had been growing across medieval Europe for centuries before anyone thought to burn it deliberately. It was everywhere. Peasants grew it in their fields alongside flax and rye. Rope makers twisted it into cordage strong enough to hold a castle drawbridge. Sailmakers stretched it across merchant vessels crossing the channel. Weavers turned it into rough cloth for the tunics that every person below the nobility wore against their skin from birth to burial. Physicians boiled it into preparations for joint pain and sleeplessness. Medieval Europe ran on hemp the way the modern world runs on plastic. It was in everything, under everything, holding everything together. And almost nobody thought of it as something you could smoke. They were too busy using it for everything else to consider what else it might do. The shift happened quietly, and it happened early. Researchers excavating a medieval settlement in Colchester, England, found evidence of cannabis use in hearth residue dating to around 1000 AD. Not industrial hemp burning accidentally in a cooking fire. Deliberate burning in an enclosed space with the same chemical signature that turns up in every intentional cannabis find from the ancient world. Someone in a medieval English village, 1,000 years ago, had figured out what happened when you held the smoke in. And here is what makes that find strange. They kept it quiet. There are almost no written records of cannabis use among medieval peasants. Not because it wasn't happening, because the people doing it had no reason to write anything down and every reason to stay silent about it. Then they found the pipes. Starting in the late medieval period, clay pipes began turning up in archaeological digs across northern Europe in numbers that surprised researchers. Not tobacco pipes. Tobacco didn't reach Europe until the 1490s. These pipes predate Columbus by a century or more. Researchers tested the residue in dozens of them. Cannabis turned up repeatedly. In English market towns, in German trading settlements, in Dutch port cities, and always in the same context, working-class sites. Tavern floors, street middens, the back rooms of craftsmen's workshops, blacksmiths' yards, the corners of grain stores. Not in noble houses, not in church records, not in the spaces where anyone with authority was paying attention. In the places where ordinary people spent their ordinary lives doing things nobody was writing down and nobody in power particularly wanted to see. The pipes were not hidden. They were simply beneath the notice of anyone who kept records, which is how most of medieval peasant life actually worked. And here is something easy to miss. The medieval church knew. Church courts across England and Germany produced records throughout the 13th and 14th centuries of peasants charged with using herba cannabina, the hemp herb, for purposes unrelated to rope or cloth. The charges were filed under the same legal category as witchcraft and folk medicine, which tells you exactly how the church positioned it, not as a moral failing, as a threat to ecclesiastical authority. The village herbalist who knew what hemp could do was competition for the priest who controlled what substances could alter your spiritual state. That competition had consequences. Several women in England were brought before church courts in the 14th century specifically for administering cannabis preparations to the sick. The charges were not that they had harmed anyone. The charges were that they had helped people without permission from the church. One case from a village in Norfolk in 1371 describes a woman referred to in the records only as Agnes the herbalist. She had been treating pain, fever, and what the records call melancholy of the spirit for more than 2 decades. Her neighbors testified that she had never harmed a patient. The parish priest testified that she had never sought his blessing. That was enough. She was fined, warned, and forbidden to practice. The records do not say whether she stopped. Parish records from the same village show her name appearing in accounts of the sick for another 11 years after the court ruling. She did not stop. She just stopped being visible about it. Agnes was not unusual. She was typical. Across medieval England and Germany, the women who carried the knowledge of what hemp could do were the same women the church could not quite eliminate and could not quite control. They were too useful. When the priest's prayers failed and the physician's bleeding made things worse, the family sent for the herbalist, and the herbalist brought what worked. But they kept using it, and the reason they kept using it is the same reason every culture across every continent eventually found this plant and held on to it. Your body was already built for it, before you ever touched it. You naturally produce a molecule called anandamide, named after the Sanskrit word for bliss. Cannabis produces a chemical that fits into the exact same receptor slot, like a spare key to a lock your body already had installed. Medieval peasants had no pharmacology, no molecular biology, no understanding of receptors or neurotransmitters. What they had was experience. They knew what the herb did when you burned it, when you boiled it into a drink, when you packed it into a poultice against a wound. They knew it quieted pain that nothing else touched. They knew it slowed a racing mind on the night before a hanging or a hard birth. They knew it made the darkness at the end of a 17-hour field day feel less like a wall and more like a door. A medieval peasant working from first light to last light, 6 days a week, with one guaranteed day of enforced church attendance, had extremely limited options for relief. Hemp was legal to grow. It was already in the field, and it worked. That knowledge passed from mother to daughter, from village healer to apprentice, from tavern keeper to regular customer, person to person across generations of ordinary life, never written down, never officially sanctioned, and never completely suppressed. The suppression got serious in the 15th century. As the church consolidated its grip on folk medicine and local healing traditions, the herbs associated with village healers became progressively more dangerous to use openly. The same decades that produced the first major witch trials in Switzerland and Germany also produced a sharp decline in the archaeological evidence of cannabis pipes in ecclesiastical settlements. The plant did not disappear. The evidence of it disappeared, which is a different thing entirely. What was once smoked quietly in a craftsman's back room moved to the edge of the village, to the forest clearing, to the spaces the church could not easily see into. And then the plague arrived. Between 1347 and 1351, the Black Death killed somewhere between a third and half of Europe's population in 4 years. Medieval medicine had nothing that worked. The physicians bled their patients and the patients died faster. The priests prayed over the dying and caught the sickness themselves. The herbalists did what they had always done, which was work with what they had, and watch what happened. Historical records from Italian and French monasteries show a sharp increase in the medicinal use of cannabis preparations during plague years, documented this time because the crisis was too vast to hide and the need too urgent to refuse on theological grounds. Abbots who had spent decades discouraging folk medicine were suddenly writing to each other asking what the village healers were using, because whatever the church was doing was not working, and whatever the herbalists were doing was at least keeping some people calm enough to survive the fear. When a third of your community is dying in the street, theological objections to the village herbalists' methods become significantly harder to enforce and significantly easier to quietly drop. For roughly 4 centuries, from the Norman conquest to the eve of the Reformation, medieval peasants grew hemp, processed hemp, wore hemp, built their houses with hemp rope, sailed on ships held together by hemp rigging, and quietly, persistently, at the edges of official record and well away from ecclesiastical authority, burned it. The church called it dangerous. The courts called it witchcraft. The peasants called it useful, and kept going. Cannabis has been part of European peasant life since before the medieval period began. It was illegal for portions of it, suppressed for more. But here is what the archaeology keeps finding, underneath every layer of official prohibition. The pipes, the residue, the hearth deposits, the pouch in the monk's chest. Every time researchers look carefully at what ordinary medieval people actually did rather than what they were supposed to do, the same plant keeps turning up. They were never going to stop, and the people who spent centuries trying to make them stop never quite managed it.